All right, so I know you've been wanting to do a deep dive on John Everett Millais' painting, Ophelia. And well, let me tell you, you are in for such a treat.
It's one of those paintings that just draws you in, you
Yeah,
know?
absolutely.
Like, it's visually stunning, of course,
Oh, yeah.
but there's so much more to it than meets the eye.
It's so true. And there are so many layers to unpack, and that's exactly what we're going to do today.
I'm excited.
So Millais himself, he was part of this really interesting group of artists called the Pre-Raphaelites, kind of like the art rebels of their time.
Yeah, they were all about breaking the mold.
Totally. And they were obsessed with nature, with this intense realism, almost photographic. And you can see that obsession in every single detail of Ophelia.
Now, speaking of details, we can't forget the subject matter.
Okay, now you're speaking my language. Give me all the Shakespearean drama.
All right, so the painting depicts Ophelia from Hamlet, obviously. But it's actually a moment that's only described in the play, never actually staged.
Interesting. Okay, so set the scene for us.
So Ophelia's already been through a lot. Her father, Polonius, has just been killed by Hamlet.
Who she also happens to be madly in love with. Talk about a recipe for disaster.
Right, and it just keeps getting worse.
Hmm.
She's completely heartbroken. She loses it and ends up wandering in nature singing these haunting songs.
So she's not in a good place.
Not at all. And then, as Gertrude describes it, she falls into the river and drowns.
Oh, wow.
And Millais chose to capture that incredibly fragile moment right before tragedy strikes.
It's so haunting when you think about it that way, and you really feel that sense of impending doom when you look at the painting.
You really do.
So we've got this tragic Shakespearean heroine, but then Millais places her in this very specific English river, the Hogsmill River.
Which is interesting because the play is set in Denmark.
Exactly. You would think he'd go for a more, Danish landscape.
Right, and it gets even more specific than that because a local resident actually tracked down the exact location years later, a place called 6 Acre Meadow.
No way. So you can actually visit the spot where Millais painted this iconic artwork.
It's like a pilgrimage for art lovers.
Seriously, but here's the thing that just blows my mind. Millais was so dedicated to getting this scene just right that he spent months painting outdoors, like in all kinds of weather.
He was that committed to realism.
I know, it's incredible. He even had this little straw hut built on site to protect himself from the elements.
Which speaks to that core value of the Pre-Raphaelites, this intense devotion to capturing the natural world in all its detail.
It's not just a pretty backdrop, though, is it?
Definitely not. Remember that puzzle box of meaning I mentioned earlier?
Oh, yeah, with all the flowers?
Exactly. Those flowers surrounding Ophelia,
Yeah.
they're not just there for decoration. They actually hold specific meanings.
Okay, you have to unpack this for me.
Right, so think about the Victorian language of flowers.
Where each flower had a specific symbolic meaning.
Exactly. It's like a secret code embedded within the painting.
Wow, I love that. Okay, so give us an example.
Well, let's take the poppies, for instance.
The poppies.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Poppies weren't even mentioned in the play.
Really?
Millais added them himself.
Interesting. So what's the significance of the poppies?
Well, what do poppies symbolize?
Oh, wow, that's right. Poppies represent sleep and death.
Exactly.
It's like this visual echo of her tragic fate.
Precisely. And that's just one example. There are so many other symbolic messages woven into those flowers.
This is like a scavenger hunt for meaning.
I like to think of it that way.
I am so here for it. Now, we can't talk about Ophelia without mentioning the model Elizabeth Siddal.
Of course, Elizabeth Siddal, a muse for so many of the Pre-Raphaelites.
She wasn't just any model. She was an artist and a poet herself.
A very talented woman.
And posing for Ophelia? I mean, that couldn't have been easy.
No, it definitely wasn't glamorous. Let's just say she suffered for her art.
What do you mean?
Well, Millais has had her pose in a bathtub.
A bathtub?
Yes, a bathtub full of water.
Oh, no.
And not just for a few minutes either. We're talking hours on end to get that just sinking below the surface look just right.
I can't even imagine.
And get this, the story goes that Millais was so focused on his painting that he didn't even notice when the lamps heating the water went out.
Oh my gosh, are you serious?
I am.
Poor Elizabeth, she must have been freezing.
She caught a terrible cold because of it.
That's awful.
Her father even sent Millais a bill for her medical expenses.
I can't say I blame him.
Right.
It really makes you appreciate the finished work even more, knowing the effort that went into it.
Absolutely.
So all that to say, Ophelia, it's a masterpiece for sure, but it wasn't an immediate hit with everyone, right?
You're right. It definitely caused a stir. Remember we were talking about the Pre-Raphaelites being those art rebels?
Yeah.
Well, the art world back then, they were used to a very different kind of painting, much more traditional, a more idealized kind of beauty.
right? All those perfectly posed figures, and mythical scenes.
Exactly. And then here comes Millais with Ophelia, and it's this almost shockingly realistic portrayal of a woman on the verge of drowning, surrounded by all these accurate botanical details.
Yeah, it's not exactly what you'd call a classical Greek goddess.
Exactly. And you can imagine some people were a little shocked by it.
I bet. So what were the critics saying?
Well, it was really a mixed bag. Some critics were just blown away by Millais' technical skill. The way he captured the textures of the flowers and the water, that incredible realism.
They were impressed.
Oh, yeah. But then you had others who just found it all a bit much, too real, too raw, maybe even a little grotesque for their taste.
So it was one of those love it or hate it kind of things.
Pretty much. One critic even called it a dairy maid in a frolic, which...
Dairy maid. Wow.
Yeah, not exactly a glowing review.
Talk about a backhanded compliment.
Right. And even John Ruskin, who was like the biggest champion of the Pre-Raphaelites, even he had his doubts.
No way. I thought Ruskin loved anything that had to do with nature and Ophelia. I mean, it's practically overflowing with nature.
It is, but it wasn't the nature aspect that bothered him. He actually thought Millais' technique was amazing. But he felt that the setting was all wrong for such a tragic scene.
What do you mean?
Well, Ruskin felt that using a cultivated English garden, even with the domesticated variety of willow, just wasn't the right fit for Ophelia's death. He wanted something wilder, something more authentically Danish, I guess. He even called the landscape a garden-rolled nursery maid's paradise.
Wow, even Paradise has its critics. It's interesting, though, even those negative reviews, they actually tell us a lot about the painting, don't they?
Absolutely. They show us just how groundbreaking and different Ophelia really was, how it challenged those traditional notions of art and beauty.
And that's what good art should do, right?
Yeah.
Challenge us, make us think, start conversations.
Exactly. And speaking of conversations, Ophelia has definitely sparked a lot of them over the years. It's become this iconic image, referenced and reinterpreted countless times.
It's like this painting has taken on a life of its own beyond the canvas.
It really has. Ophelia is everywhere. Film, music photography, literature, you name it. It's probably been inspired by this painting in some way.
Okay, give us some examples. I'm dying to know how Ophelia's popped up in pop culture.
Well, there's the obvious one, Laurence Olivier's 1948 film adaptation of Hamlet. He actually used Ophelia as a direct visual reference for Ophelia's death scene.
Really? Wow, I'm going to have to rewatch that scene.
You should. And it's not just classic cinema either. More modern directors like Lars von Trier have used similar imagery and themes in their films like Melancholia.
And what about music? I feel like those Ophelia vibes have definitely made their way into music videos.
Oh, absolutely. One that immediately comes to mind is Nick Cave's video for Where the Wild Roses Grow with Kylie Minogue. It's a hauntingly beautiful homage to Ophelia.
It always comes back to the flowers. It's incredible how this one painting has just seeped into our collective consciousness. Even if people don't recognize the painting itself, they've definitely felt its influence.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to the power of the image itself, the beauty, the tragedy, the way it captures that fleeting moment between life and death. It's something that continues to resonate with people on a deep level.
And then when you add in everything else, we've talked about the Shakespearean backstory, the symbolism of the flowers, even the real-life drama behind the scenes with Elizabeth Siddle, it's no wonder this painting has become such an enigma.
It really is a fascinating story.
Speaking of enigmas, you mentioned something earlier about a missing vole.
Ah, yes. The Case of the Vanishing Vole.
Okay, you can't just drop a bombshell like that and not elaborate. What's the story with this missing rodent? Okay, so back to the vanishing vole. You can't just drop that little mystery on us and not give us the details. What's the deal with this missing rodent?
Well, it really is one of art history's little mysteries. Apparently, when Millais first started working on Ophelia, he actually included a water vole in the painting, swimming in the river right next to her.
A vole?
Yeah, we know this because he mentions it in letters and diary entries from the time it...
So he was very clearly like, there's a vole there, check it out.
Exactly. But then when he finally unveiled the finished painting to the public, the vole was gone.
Gone.
Gone. Completely painted over. No trace of it.
Wait a minute, this is Millais. We're talking about Mr. Detail-oriented,
Yeah.
the guy who spent months painting every single leaf and petal, braving the elements just to get the reflections in the water just so, and he just paints over a perfectly good vole.
It's a head scratcher. For sure.
Why would he do that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Art historians have been debating this for years.
So do we have any theories?
We have a few clues. There's some accounts from the time that suggest that before exhibiting the painting, Millais showed it to some friends and family members, to get their opinions.
Sure, like a private viewing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And according to his diary, No one seemed to recognize the vole for what it was.
They didn't know it was a vole. What did they think it was?
Some guessed it was a hare, others thought it was a rabbit, some even said a dog.
A dog. Seriously.
Yeah, it seems no one could agree on what that little creature was.
So maybe he just thought it was too distracting, like people weren't getting the vole memo.
That's one possibility.
Oh.
Or maybe he realized it just didn't quite work with the overall composition. Maybe he was too busy, too much of a focal point, or maybe even a little too whimsical for such a somber scene.
I see what you mean. But here's my thought. Knowing Millais and his obsession with detail, and especially his use of symbolism with the flowers, I can't help but wonder if he also considered the symbolic meaning of the vole.
That's a really interesting point.
Like, was there a whole Victorian language of rodents that I'm unaware of? What did a vole represent back then?
And that's what makes this missing detail so fascinating. We're left to speculate to come up with our own interpretations.
So what are some of the theories?
Well, some art historians believe the vole might have symbolized resurrection or rebirth. Like a little glimmer of hope in the face of all that tragedy.
Kind of like a symbol of new life emerging?
Exactly. Others have suggested it might represent something a bit darker, like decay or the fleeting nature of life.
Oh, wow. Two very different interpretations.
Right. It's almost as if Millais left this little blank space, this visual question mark, right in the middle of his masterpiece.
I love that idea. It's like he's inviting us, the viewers, to become detectives of meaning.
Exactly. He wants us to engage with the work, to think critically, to come up with our own conclusions.
I love that.
Yeah.
So what do you think, what do you make of the case of the vanishing vole?
I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. I think it's more about the act of looking closely, of questioning, of appreciating the layers of meaning that a work of art can hold, even centuries later.
Absolutely. And sometimes those unanswered questions, those little mysteries, they're part of what keeps a painting like Ophelia alive in our imagination.
It's true. Keeps us coming back for more. Looking closer, noticing new things each time.
It reminds us that art isn't meant to be just passively observed. It's meant to spark our curiosity, to challenge our perceptions, to leave us with more questions than answers.
And I think that's a perfect note to end on, don't you think?
I think so. It seems like we've done our due diligence in unpacking John Everett Millais' Ophelia, at least for one deep dive.
We could probably spend a whole other episode just talking about the symbolism of the flowers.
Absolutely. But for now, I think it's time to let our listeners dive back into the source material themselves. Maybe see if they can uncover any secrets we missed.
And if you do, be sure to let us know.
That's right. We love hearing from you. Join us next time when we'll be taking on another deep dive, exploring a whole new work of art with its own fascinating backstory and layers of meaning. Until then, happy exploring.